Crowdfunding is a really new topic, as you all know. And my experience, I served in the Clinton administration, and I was an entrepreneur myself, having done various startups, and then I ran a charitable foundation called the Deshpande Foundation for several years in Boston. If you're familiar with the MIT Deshpande Center and that model for tech transfer, we had started that and about 30 similar centers around the world, and came into the administration to run the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship to really take some of the lessons learned from our experience at MIT and other universities in the United States, and what does that mean for national policy. Just as I came in, sort of the Jobs Act was finishing up, and this new thing, crowdfunding, became part of law. And when I had been at Deshpande, we had actually funded a group called Kiva, which I'll get into a little bit here on the charitable side, and we had also funded a lot of entrepreneurs and helped them to get started through Kickstarter and other sites. And that in itself made me an expert in the federal government on crowdfunding. And so I've now done 10 or so presentations along this same line. And the point of that story is to say that this is just a really new topic. And from the federal side, we're really just monitoring what's going on. There's some rulings that will come out, some initial set of rules in the next few months. But really, this is super, super new. And many of you will know more than I do. And unfortunately, right now, I know more than many of my colleagues in the federal government. But again, I expect that to change in the next year or so as this becomes real from a federal perspective. I know you have speakers today who are actually practitioners who know more about what's going on. But what I wanted to give you a sense of is when the Jobs Act came to pass, and essentially what happened with crowdfunding was more of a change in the rule of what's an accredited investor. That was really the core change that the law made into effect as it relates to seed investing. Right? There are some other things around the definition of an emerging company and things to help companies go public. So, but the crowdfunding thing, essentially, it was changing the language around that. But that led to a whole series of questions about crowdfunding, the model, what happens. And so I wanted to get into a little bit of that, but also a lot of different agencies are looking at this model, both internally and externally, and looking at our partners and how are they approaching crowdfunding. That's really all we know right now is at a national level, what are the different experiments we're seeing around crowdfunding, and whether you're economic development agency, whether you're NIH, NSF, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, what are we seeing as examples out there that are relevant from a economic growth and development perspective. So that's kind of what this goes over. It's more of an overview of what we're seeing in the field and what we're thinking about it from a federal level, more than it is any insights onto what's working or not, because at this point, from the federal perspective, we don't really have any comment on that or opinion on that. So the first thing I'll mention is that the Jobs Act, it passed, became law in early spring. We finished the comment period to the SEC about this, but we haven't received the first set of rules. So the SEC, the Justice Department, and the Treasury Department were initially the ones, the initial task force put together to create the first set of rules about what will be allowed and not allowed with crowdfunding. It's an interesting choice of agencies because it relates directly to, obviously, financial oversight, but the SBA was left out of that, Commerce was left out of that, and some of the agencies that were really looking forward to this law, like the research agencies, were also not the biggest part of the rule crafting, even though they are closer to what's going on the ground, and that's for mandate reasons and other things. But we expect the SEC to issue some rules fairly soon. It was supposed to be the end of this year. I believe it's been pushed back now by a few weeks with the fiscal cliff negotiations all going on, but that'll certainly come out. SEC is not always best staffed for some of these new and emerging business models and ways of funding, but I think they're fairly quickly getting up to speed, and I think our insight is that the rules will generally make people happy in version 1.0. What we're hoping is after that, those of us who are working directly with crowdfunding practitioners will be able to engage and craft our own policies around that. For example, my office runs the I-6 Challenge, which is a grant challenge that nonprofit research agencies and universities often apply for proof of concept. And in that, we're actually encouraging crowdfunding as a vehicle for raising capital, since venture capital is not available in most parts of the country where we've been funding I-6 centers. But we haven't been able to really promote that yet because we're not sure what we can and can't promote. So on the regulatory framework, I think 2013 will be a very exciting year. We'll see the first set of rules. We'll see agencies start implementing that into their grant challenges for the first time, and then sort of figure out what worked and what didn't. And the reality is that we're going to ask everybody to think about crowdfunding as a model. Some of them will do it well, a lot of them won't. And what I hope is that we don't get discouraged about it as a federal government in terms of promotion of crowdfunding, just because the first set of applications next year that integrate crowdfunding are more experimental and don't necessarily work perfectly. So that's where we are with the legislative update on that. It is also, I should mention, is going to be a big part of the president's entrepreneurship agenda for the second term. So we recently had a meeting around Startup America, which is our sort of all-encompassing effort around entrepreneurship. And in that, it was specifically mentioned, what can we do to nurture crowdfunding across the country? And so these sort of major buckets are what we're looking at. This really started in the microfinance and urban entrepreneurship space, and it really started more internationally than domestically. The two leading sites for a long time in terms of volume were Kiva. How many of you know Kiva, by the way? Or how many of you have given money online for Kiva? Okay, so just a few of you. So the Kiva model is essentially, you go to the site, there's a list of micro entrepreneurs from the developing world listed. Now they have a whole US component. For a long time it was a developing world. You make a donation of $25 to that entrepreneur to open a bicycle shop. That money then goes to an intermediary microfinance group that then funds that entrepreneur. When that entrepreneur pays back to the loan, you get it back. It goes into the equivalent of a trading account model, and you get the tax deduction, but the money just recycles. You then pick another entrepreneur to fund. And that really was the first time that we saw this intersection of social media and a funding model. Obviously, nonprofits have been raising money online for many years now, but this was an interesting take on that model, and it's gotten a lot of traction. I believe they've now given out over 100 million. And in India, the company was Rangaday, because India's rules didn't allow Kiva to come in. The key issue here is this was small capital needs for entrepreneurs. It was under $5,000 for almost all the projects around the world. Even in aggregate, a microfinance organization didn't really raise more than a few thousand. And it was really investors not focused on immediate returns. It was definitely, it may have been a for-profit, but it was really what they call patient capital long-term, not looking at returns in an immediate sense, certainly not in the way that equity capital would be looking. On the small business development, this is obviously the hope with the Jobs Act is that more sites like Indiegogo and Kickstarter can come up that have really gotten a lot of publicity around this. The idea here is that most small businesses don't need and cannot get venture capital. So how do we identify ways for them to find how do we help them identify sources of capital around the country, not in just their local neighborhoods? And these are the two sites that have gotten the most publicity. Since I originally put this presentation together, I think probably last I read about 120 sites have come up that do this for small business in one form or another. As with any sector, we expect sort of an attrition process to happen, and there'll be a few companies that figure this out and some that don't. But ultimately, we're talking about small business development with these sites. I have an idea. I need just a little bit of capital. Again, this is not a 5,000. We don't have really a sense of the amount of money they're raising, but it's certainly not what the angel investments in venture and equity are looking at later down the line. This is, again, intersection of social media and free agency, as they call it, not in the academic sense, but sort of individuals driving theirs. To date, it's been much more project-driven. If you look at Kickstarter, for many, many years, it was driven mostly by the arts sector and by publishing and art and what have you, and looking at individual projects at a time. It was not capital to start a company, scale up, get the next level. It was just, I'm doing this, help me. And it was really leveraging individual networks. And so there's a lot of stories out there that if you put it up on Kickstarter, there's some stories that companies have raised 300,000 or 3 million. But the reality is, for most of the successful ones, it's just another vehicle to leverage their networks and aggregate funds from those networks. And it's a vehicle just like any other, as a conference might be, or an angel group may be for a company. It's been a vehicle to leverage and communicate with people you know in their networks to raise money. It's not been a panacea where you post the project and all of a sudden the world comes to your door. And I think that's critical to note, because I think that's what we have to be careful about when we talk about the hype versus the reality. These sites we're seeing actually spring up on the small business development side almost by community now. I think there's a realization that there'll only be a few national players, and so there's these regional efforts being developed, sometimes using the technology of the bigger players, but regional efforts that might be driven by universities or by accelerators in a community or by the states themselves to really boost small business participation in entrepreneurship. Some states like Louisiana and North Dakota are trying to tie it into their angel tax credits so that more people will invest in the startups and the small business ideas in their states and realize that they can get a tax benefit for it. So the small business development side is really where a lot of the energy is in reality. I think the press goes towards the equity part of it, but the reality is we're seeing a lot more energy at the local levels as a regional economic driver here. On the charitable site, the interesting thing, as I mentioned earlier, microfinance and charity is really where this started. A couple of the leading sites historically over the last few years in this space, Akiva, as I mentioned earlier, it's a charitable donation. It's for microfinance, but you get a deduction for it and the money stays in an account. It's the Case Foundation also, this is Steve Case, also sort of was one of the first large, well-known charitable foundations to look at crowdsourcing by voting for what they would fund as an idea. And so people would donate to the Case Foundation, Case would match, and then the people would vote and select which projects to fund. That's gotten a lot of traction amongst Ashoka, American Express, and others. It's really cause marketing plus social media more than anything else. Case Foundation's strategy for giving money was set by the Case Foundation, so it's not like the public participation really changed their mind about what to invest in, but it allowed them to highlight their projects, engage the public, and double the amount of money that they gave. And so they essentially, more than crowdfunding, it was more of them leveraging their size, their resources, their name brand to raise more money for their nonprofits. But they did create a platform that a lot of foundations liked. American Express with its members project, very similar, give money to and vote on a cause and we'll raise money for the projects that we care about the most. The key issues there, as I mentioned, were voting, no expectations of return, and a tax deduction. One thing I want to mention we've seen a lot of in the last year with this space is that the university community is looking very much at this as a way of funding research, actually. And so as federal funds are up in the air for discussion, how much will be available, as federal funds, in particularly commerce and others, we're looking at some money going for commercialization. Universities are saying, how can we leverage crowdfunding sites for nonprofit activities on campus, particularly research in areas that is not historically funded by NIH or NSF, so not just social sciences, but some of the areas in health that don't get as much money from NIH or NSF or others. Similarly, universities that are heavily reliant on DoD funding are looking at crowdfunding as a way to help some of their other faculty get awareness about their work, if not money as well. So a lot of universities have said they're going to set up their own crowdfunding sites that leverage their alumni networks, their local community bases, and they're going to open it up to other universities and colleges, particularly community colleges and others in the area that are practicing entrepreneurship, and try to create a regional hub to raise money. And again, in many ways, this is similar to their development efforts in general. They're raising money from their community to support projects on campus. But the shift, and it's a subtle shift, is going from the dorms and big gifts for infrastructure to more of how do you leverage the experiences of the individuals that are part of their community to support the people in their community, the faculty and the students with their projects. The most advanced on this, I think, is Caltech, which is actually developing not just a crowdfunding site, but has also put their tech transfer and their corporate development and advancement all in the same office in the same building. And so taking a very strategic approach to not just funding their infrastructure, but their students and faculty for the entrepreneurship and ideas that they have. Debt financing, so now we're getting into some of the newer sites and that have been the promise of crowdfunding. We're essentially, to date, talking about sites that are intermediaries to larger lenders. We're talking about repayment that's managed by the lenders and also sort of the trading account model. This is, I think, where, although SEC has been writing the rules, ultimately this is probably going to come under SBA because it relates directly to their mandate around debt financing and lending to small businesses around the country. Not too much on our end going on in this space just yet, because we're waiting for the first set of rules. With angel investments, and again, your next speaker can probably talk more about this, but and about the projects that are being thought of through crowdfunding for angel investments. What we're seeing mostly through the sites that come to see us are the scalable ideas, or the ideas looking to scale, that are not yet ready for institutional investors. So this is not Valley of Death, but this is almost pre-Valley of Death. They're getting started, want to get some sense of how much angel investment is required, and using crowdfunding as a way to sort of market themselves. The Valley of Death folks are still going to more institutional investors and using their tech transfer offices and personal connections to raise more money. Interestingly enough, in the 3D printing space, we're seeing crowdfunding become very popular because of, again, low cost of buying the printers and raising money to get started with your first product, and then selling on the net, sort of in a on-demand model. And so they are using crowdfunding sites a little bit more, which is very interesting, because historically people didn't think of new technologies and crowdfunding as going hand in hand. And to see some of the folks in 3D printing, which is a very, very new technology, so compared to what else is going on there, has been really interesting. And it sort of led to this discussion in the federal government that maybe manufacturing, clean tech, additive manufacturing, these spaces don't necessarily need millions and millions of dollars to get started if the actual startup manufacturers in 3D printing are they themselves thinking they can get started with $5,000, $10,000, $50,000. So it's caused us to start thinking that maybe the business model is changing for manufacturing and for clean tech, and maybe we don't need to make financing facilities of several million available, which is very hard, frankly, for the federal government to find right now. And so we're watching that with a lot of care to see what happens, who succeeds, who doesn't. And then finally, the venture capital and equity investments. Here I think the hope is that there will be a greater way for the startups of the world to find the institutional investors that they need. The example people use is that some of our best universities, or actually a better example more recently, I think, is that the venture capital space, 90% of it is in San Francisco, Boston, and New York City. But those three cities do not hold a monopoly on 90% of the good ideas. And so can crowdfunding be the way that all the great ideas in other places that actually are scalable, are backed by science, are backed by patents, can find the access to capital they need? The business model is still developing for some of the newer sites on this. The key issues around the high cost of due diligence, the lack of legal clarity around dilution as those companies raise more and more rounds, and is the model right for big wins? The conversations we've had with our advisory councils and others is usually around the idea we just don't know yet if this is the model to find the real big winners or not. People have, this is, mostly our we have a National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. They've really been the ones sort of advising the administration on some of these things, and many of the members of that just aren't clear whether this will be right for the venture space, particularly given what venture is going through right now of difficulty of getting the returns they need in some of the more complex technology spaces like clean tech and life sciences. So these questions of the due diligence costs, the returns, is this the best way to find the entrepreneur you need to talk to? Those are really sort of up in the air. And most entrepreneurs and VCs are saying this will just be another vehicle, just like attending the 100K business contest at their local university, just like networking, getting references through their to the legal community or professional services community to find the next entrepreneur. This will just probably, like a lot of things with technology, speed up the process and allow them to learn a little bit in advance about new and emerging spaces like 3D printing. So that's sort of an overview. I think that covers it. So again, not too much new to report in terms of the rules, but I think these are the sort of the big areas where we're seeing activity in the field, and these are the people coming to the Department of Commerce, to the administration, and saying, we're thinking about this. How does this tie into your, if it's charitable, how does it tie into your EDA I-6 challenge? If it's equity, it's how does this tie into SBA's lending model, the new SBIC funds they've announced in early technology, and how does this going to tie in there? And so that's what we're trying to understand, trying to figure out, and hopefully next year I think will be a very exciting year in terms of actually having practitioners of crowdfunding as a part of our federal grant challenges. So